hearing your insights on I Sing the Mighty Power of God.
Okay, so now we're going to go to I Sing the Mighty Power of God. And I think I need to say at the beginning of this one that Tim Willingham, Dr. Willingham, and I are working together on this. I want you to know that. Even in the first two, I did the most. The other two podcasts that you've seen this month or heard, Tim let me talk all the way. But now I hope he joins in and gives some explanation of some of the things that I was talking about. Because my mind goes so fast, and his does too. Mm-hmm. But I want you to see this is a joint project. Mm-hmm. This is not just Frank Garlock talking. This is Tim Willingham adding his knowledge. He has taught theory, and he teaches not only theory, he teaches handbells, has a choir, and does all kinds of things. So I want to get his input on this so that you can glean from that as well. But this is an interesting one because it came at a time when the people were fighting battles over what they were going to do with the way the churches in the early 18th century. There was still a battle going over. Do we just use the Psalms? Because the Psalms were written for the Hebrew language.
Right.
And can you explain that, why they don't work so much for the English language?
It's the structure of the language is quite different from how we think in English. And so as you get a faithful translation like the King James Version that sticks very close to the original language, then sometimes the poetry of it is lost because Hebrew poetry is different than English poetry. And so then folks like Isaac Watts that we're talking about before we started recording the podcast, he and others came behind and took the thought and heart and all of the psalm, but then took also the poetry idea from the Hebrew and then made it into poetry in the English as well, because it's such a different approach to poetry, being a completely different language.
Boy, that's interesting to know. As we look at these old songs, what some of these men were facing at that time.
Right.
Isaac Watts was one of them. The people who wrote this, it was the same type of thing. This was Isaac Watts again.
Yeah.
So the poetry of the Hebrew, the accents are different.
Right.
In fact, if you look at Hebrew, you start at the right-hand side and you go back to the left. And you start at the end of the page and go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
So to try to set that, that's where these people who claim that the King James only is the inspired version, it can't do it. No. Man has to try to interpret and make it, and that's what Isaac Watts did. So now, it just so happens for this month's podcast, we're looking at two hymns that were written in the church was beginning to use human composure. That's what the opponents said about Isaac Watts and even Charles Wesley. They said, you're writing human composure. We don't want you've got to get your personality into it.
Oh, yeah.
Can we verify that's necessary? I think if you look at the hymns, you'll say, they are biblical. And even Isaac Watts actually tried to take some of the things that applied to the Israelites and made them apply to Christ.
Right.
He said, this is talking about what's coming in the future, so he already did it in the poetry.
Good.
So they were not verbatim words of Scripture. You can't do it. Those who have tried failed. This reminds me of the King James Version debate that is current. Any translation necessarily be man's interpretation of what the original language said. Even the italicized words in the King James illustrate that.
Oh, yeah.
You look at your King James Version, you'll see some words are in Italian. That means it wasn't there originally.
But it helps us understand.
They tried to make it as clear as they could.
Yes.
And even if you don't have, let me recommend, if you don't have it, the introduction that the King James translators wrote to the King James Bible, what they said they were doing. They said, we're not trying to make a new translation. We're trying to make an old translation better.
Yes.
And if you can correct what we did wrong, go ahead and fix it.
Fix it, yeah.
They openly declared that.
Yeah.
What we just said applies to both for the "Oh for a Thousand Tongues" that we've already talked about, and "I Sing the Mighty Power of God." The two lyricists, Charles Wesley and Isaac Watts, and the composers, Thomas Jarman, and the editors of Wurtemberg, and Tim, I want you to get that spelled right for me. The U has a two dots over the
two
top of
dots.
the U. I don't know how to do it. Face the same thing in the early 18th century. That is obvious in both hymns that we are looking at. So if you're looking at the music that accompanies this podcast, the first thing you will notice is that Dr. Willingham and I did with the 3 unisons in all the hymn books that have this hymn. We wrote varied harmonic treatments of the first 5 notes. If you like the first 5 notes, dum, da, da, bum, bum. Now, I think the original people who wrote this back in the 18th century that were trying to say come as close as they could because it was originally just a simple statement. So what I think we did, or together, we started off on a unison F, and then we had 4 parts going for the first 5 notes. And then if you look at the measure 5, you'll see that it's the same basic harmony, but it's written differently. Doesn't come the same. And if you go back down then, you'd measure 9, of course, everything changes because even the melody is different. When we get back to the melody, measure 13, then even the bass is different here. So you get it 3 different ways to make I sing the mighty power. You get it several different ways. To me, that makes it more effective, and I think that's what Tim and I were trying to do. Okay, we also added the different chords for measure 11 to make the harmony different from measure 9, believing that the chord change strengthens the second half of the Hebrew parallelism that is now the same chord progression in only measures 7 and 8 and 15 and 16. Our thinking was that the Württemberg, and I don't even say that word, Württemberg, as we'd say, wanted to keep it as simple as they could for children.
Right.
I thought, don't you think that's what they were doing? Trying to keep it simple because it was originally done for children. Because Isaac Watts even wrote a whole book just on music for children. I may mention that here. Okay, the lyric painting that this hymn exhibits is startling to say the least for the time that it was written. All the men who have written about here were facing an uphill battle against the thinking of the early 18th century. I would like to mention a book that may be hard to obtain, but it may take you a while to try to find it. I will mention it at the end of this podcast. I won't mention it now.
Okay.
I'll mention it at the end. I've got it written down.
Okay.
Beginning in measure 2, there are several archetypes that effectively paint the lyrics. The first count of measure 2 is a 6 chord in close structure with a double third, followed by contrary motion for the power of God. See, that's an archetype. That emphasizes when you get a contrary, the soprano's going up, bass is going down. That right. Contrary motion is an archetype. However, at that same point, the melody begins on D and goes all the way up the octave with temporary stops on F and C and parallel 6 on counts 2 and 3 between the bass and melody in measure 3 to paint the words "made the mountains rise." And you can see how that paints it. Made the mountains rise. I mean, it goes up there. There's a reason for that. It's also worth noting that even the melody comes down on counts 2 and 3 of measure 7. The parallel tense between the same 2 voices strengthens the lofty skies. So you get the mountains rise and then the lofty skies. So it colors them differently. The last change we made to the 3 unisons is in measure 13. To color the moon shines bright, we employed a second version of the tonic chord, moving in contrary motion between the bass and the treble voices to a tonic 1 chord with a double third on count 3, followed by a 1/7, followed by a 1/7 augmented major 7th chord in second inversion on count 4 that strongly paints the moon shines full at his command. We then left measure 15 and 16 the same as measures 5 and 6, portray the last 5 words of all 3 stanzas and how they exemplify the mighty power of God. The book I mentioned in the 6th paragraph is The Poetic Interpretation of the Psalms by Isaac Watts. With a biography of the author, it is credited as by W.A. Wojciech and is published in Bible Memory Association International.
And then there's a more recent one, Singing Psalms with Isaac Watts. This was published in 2004, and I think this might still be available from a search I did earlier.
So if they can't get I've had the other one for years, the old one that Wojciech did. So that's a new one. It gives the same material, and you can quote anything he gives by Isaac Watts, because that was not copyrighted. But Wojciech, just be careful if you use it, that you credit Wojciech with what he said.
Absolutely.
In either one of those books, if you're able to get if you have the first one. And by the way, Wojciech also did a book of songs for the Memory Association that he was associated with. And I, of course, got ideas from him. That's where we came up with the idea of putting the first letter of each word of the Bible. And I could still do the last 4 chapters of Revelation.
Wow.
And even the first 3 chapters, if you give me the first letters. I can quote all 7 chapters, not exactly, but all very close to what the Revelation says. And I got the idea from Wojciech and his Bible Memory Association.
Oh, that's great.